Hello, and welcome to our Chapter a Day series as we're going through the book of Genesis. Today we are at Genesis chapter 11. So we have gone through the journey from the initial story of the creation of the world, the creation of humanity, humanity's fall, turning in disobedience from God, and coming under the captivity of sin. We talked about that journey of humankind, generation to generation, the incidences of sin that we see. We came to the story of the flood and God's judgment upon the earth. And then his redemption, his saving of Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, and bringing them safely through the flood. And God's renewed covenant with humanity coming out the other side. Now we find ourselves at chapter 11. And it's important, before we look at chapter 11, that we remember God's command to his people. As image bearers of God, he gave us certain instructions. And one of those instructions in our creation was that we were to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. This was the instruction given to us in the initial creation narrative when God said that let us make man in our image and in our likeness. And he created man in the image of God, male and female, he created them. And he said, this is what I call you to do, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And we see that natural mandate being fulfilled generation after generation as we read of those who had offspring. Then after the flood, as God is reinstating his covenants with humanity, he again gives humanity the command in this earth that has now been swept clean and is now coming back to life after the flood, and God removes the curse from the ground. He says to humanity again to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. It is this part here that is of significance as we go into what we're going to encounter in Genesis chapter 11. So let's open up to Genesis chapter 11, remembering the initial and then the restated command of God that humanity, as the image bearers of God, are to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. So starting the beginning of chapter 11. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. So we have this initial command to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Humanity, with the exception of Noah, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, had been wiped out under the judgment of the flood. Now, once again, families are beginning to grow, and families are growing into tribes, into clans, and are beginning to multiply according to the command of God, according to the way that he has created us as image bearers. But then we come to this account that as these groups are beginning to move from the east, from east to west, they encounter a valley. the valley of Shinar, and it seems to be a very good place. It's a fertile place. And so they decide, instead of continuing to migrate outward, spreading out by families and clans and tribes, we see that the people decide among themselves that they will create a city, that they will create for themselves a single point. They will build it up. They will give it a central focus. They will build a name for themselves. And we see in this account of the building of the city and of its central focus, the tower. What we see is that humanity is once again acting in disobedience to God. Rather than going out and spreading out in families and clans and tribes, spreading out on the earth, subduing the earth, as in the initial command, they have decided, no, we're going to stay together, because then we can capitalize on our strength, on our power. We can stay together. There'll be nothing, humanly speaking, that we can't do. If we can rally our forces together, if we can subjugate the weak, if we can capitalize on our advantage, we are going to make this place. And in the center of it, we have this expression of a tower to the heavens. We know from our understanding of ancient cultures that there is a beginning of a growth in religions, beliefs based on the stars. In a form of astrology. So in that expression, we're going to build a tower that will reach the heavens. In all likelihood, it probably was a ziggurat, which was a step pyramid that we find in the ancient Near East. And oftentimes these massive step pyramids not only were the focal point or the center point of the city-state or community, but it also became a place where they would practice their religion, oftentimes mapping the stars and worshiping the heavenly bodies. So if that's the case, that is also a rebellion against God. They're rejecting God, the same God who saved their ancestors from his judgment of destruction through the flood, the same one who renewed his covenant, gave them back their original purpose. Now they are disobeying his command to fill the earth and subdue it, and they are no longer recognizing him as God. And we're told that God sees this, that the Lord witnesses what they are doing. In verse 6, and the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Of course, this is speaking humanly. Humanly, anything they set their minds to do, they will be able to do. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, first of all, of course, it's in disobedience to God's command. God's command is for them to spread out. They are trying to stay together. The other thing that we need to realize is when it says there's nothing that they can think of that will be impossible to them, we also remember from Genesis chapter 6 and then reiterate it again at the end of the flood story, what is the condition of man's mind? Man's mind and his heart are evil continually. So having these people together, there's nothing that's going to be impossible for them. What they conceive, they will do, humanly speaking, and knowing the condition of the human heart, what's going to happen when all these people are kept together. The potential for corruption and violence increases again. So how is God going to cause them to go back to fulfilling the mandate that he had given them in his wisdom, and also to address the issues of what is happening here in this valley? And so we see what God does. Verse 7, "Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." Here we see the reference, we will go down. This is similar to the we that we encountered at the beginning of Genesis, when God says, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness." The sense of this is God is not talking to the heavenly hosts. He's not talking to angelic beings. He is talking to himself in the sense of the fullness of the Trinity of the Godhead. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. We agree to this. We will do this. One God, three persons. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So God doesn't exercise a judgment on them that destroys them, but what God does is he removes their ability to control one another, and by removing their ability to control one another, they naturally begin to disperse. So God takes one people with one language, and what he effectively does by breaking up the language into separate language groups, he then causes the people in a culture which is likely almost entirely oral at this time. The ability to communicate verbally establishes how we interact. So if God changes the ability of language, he immediately causes the people to begin to spread out into separate groups. Those who speak the same language form will connect together. They will separate from those they cannot communicate with. So God, in separating languages, he breaks down the potential for harm as the people connect together in ways that will be unhealthy, and he also causes them naturally to fulfill the creation mandate, because the separate people groups begin to spread out. And we read that in the earlier genealogy, and I mentioned to you in that video how it talked about Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and it talked about how they spread out according to their clans, their languages, their lands, and their nations. So we know this now explains why a group of people who spoke one language coming off the ark, now we know them as many groups of people speaking many distinct languages. And this is the reason given here and the rationale for it that moved the people out across the earth. At the end of this chapter, we again come to a genealogy as God, through the writer of Genesis, through Moses, is helping us understand the progression forward. So we come specifically now looking at Shem's descendants. These are the generations of Shem. When Shem was 100 years old, he fathered Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived after he fathered Arphaxad 500 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Arphaxad had lived 35 years, he fathered Shelah. And Arphaxad lived after he fathered Shelah 403 years, and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah had lived 30 years, he fathered Eber. And Shelah lived after he fathered Eber 403 years, and had other sons and daughters. If we go through, one of the things that we notice as we follow through this narrative is that we begin to watch the lifespans of the people mentioned, generation by generation, are beginning to decline. We heard that already in Genesis, how God was going to reduce the lifespan, bring death, physical death, closer, reducing the lifespans of people. The physical conditions of the earth post-flood likely impacted lifespans of people. It was no longer idyllic as it was in the initial creation physical environment. Now there are issues that are beginning to decrease lifespans. So if you go through, we see the first person who's mentioned here. We see that Shem was 100 years old when he fathered Arphaxad, and he lived after that 500 years. So he was 600 years old. But by the time we come to the end of this particular list, we come to verse 24, and it says that Nahor lived 29 years, he fathered Terah. And Nahor lived after he fathered Terah 119 years. So if we go through all the names, we see a slow progression from 600 years down to, in the case of Nahor, Nahor would have been 148 years old when he died. The ages are getting shorter. And at the end of this particular genealogy, we are introduced to a very important person. A very important person in the next part of our story. Because God is laying out, for those who are reading this story, his plan to fulfill the promise that he made to Adam and Eve. The promise he made to them for redemption. So we're seeing how this is being laid out. So as we go through this genealogy, we have Shem, who received the blessing of Noah that we had read about. Shem, one of the three sons of Noah. Shem, we see his descendants going down until we come to a man named Terah. And we're told that Terah had 4 sons that are given in the list. Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abraham and Nahor took wives. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarai. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Spelling mistake there. The daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and Iscah. So Haran had both Lot And he also had Milcah, and Milcah is the one who marries Nahor. And then we see this important point here as we're going through Terah's descendants. We have Terah, he had Abraham, he had Nahor, he had Haran. Haran gave birth to Lot, a son. He also had the daughter Milcah. Haran dies young. So Haran dies. Milcah is married to Nahor. Lot then becomes the responsibility of his grandfather Terah at first. Abram marries Sarai. And then we have this important statement here in verse 30. As we're going through genealogies, as we're seeing how each person is going to have offspring and their connections, we are told this important piece of information. Sarah is barren. Sarah apparently is not able to have children. In a culture where the creation covenant to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth is being acted out, when we see the generations and how each continues and the importance in family in their natural setting to have offspring, to carry on the line, to support the family, to do the work that was necessary even for survival, this becomes an important statement. And a surprising one in a genealogy, because in most genealogies this would mean that Abram is going to simply fade off, or he's going to have to take on other wives. So we have Abram, Sarai, and that she is unable to have children. Verse 31, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. So we're getting a peek at a journey that's going to take place. So we've gone from big picture, going through generations, families, tribes. We've gone to Shem. We followed Shem's descendants down among the peoples till we've come to this person, Terah. And we've met Terah has had 3 sons that are mentioned. We know a bit about them, but a significant thing we know is that we have this man, Abram, his wife, Sarai. They're not going to be able to have children. Terah then takes his family and travels from Ur of the Chaldees, which we'll look at as far as where it appears in the map in the next video, going from Ur of the Chaldees to a place called Haran. So traveling from far down in what we would now know as the area of the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, up through to northern Syria, and then they stop there. And while they're there, Terah dies. This ends this point of the story, but it prepares to launch us on what is going to come next. So as we recap this chapter, the important things to note, we have, of course, the story of the Tower of Babel. We see the rationale for it when we see God's creation imperatives for humankind and how, again, humanity chose in disobedience to, rather than follow God's pattern, mankind was going to establish his own pattern of action and behavior, and how God thwarts that, forcing mankind to again go out and fulfill the creation mandate. We get our picture of Shem, who we heard of his blessing in an earlier chapter, and now we follow down through the line of generations, through this genealogy, to meet this pair right here, which we will now see will be the significant pair as we move forward. I hope that this is helpful to you and encouragement to you, helping you in your understanding both of God's plan, but also another glimpse of God's character in God's working with humankind. If this has been a help to you, if you have any questions or comments, please share them with us. And as always, if this blesses you, please share it with somebody else. Thank you, and God bless.